welcome. This is a weekly podcast that features interviews with A-list influencers and outliers in the great work of restoring the Judeo-Christian roots of the culture and the West in general. So if you're listening for the very first time and you want to see God back in the public square and you're not allergic to having a laugh, you have come to the right place. Today we're going to talk about religion reporting and why a lot of it sucks and what we can do about it, at least as far as spotting errors of fact and overt bias goes. We'll take a 10,000 feet above the tarmac look at religion reporting, and I can't think of anyone better with whom to do it than Terry Mattingly. Terry writes the nationally syndicated column on religion for the Universal UClick Syndicate and is a senior fellow for media and religion at the King's College in New York City. He's a veteran journalist, a teacher of theology, and has worked as a reporter and religion columnist at the Rocky Mountain News in Denver and the Charlotte News. Terry's also a fanatical music buff with interests in music ranging from Celtic 12-fret guitars to Russian chant. He joins me now from his hidden enclave in beautiful Tennessee. Hey, Terry.
Glad to be here.
Great. Long-time GetReligionista and fan of your work, so it's a real honor to have you with us on the show.
You realize that my enclave here is in a part of Tennessee that literally was hidden for several decades, because I live in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which is the famous secret city where the Manhattan Project was based.
I don't think we can talk about that. Can we just change subjects now? You mentioned the unmentionable.
What subject?
All right, so literally, figuratively and literally. You notice literally is the new figuratively.
Whatever.
I can't make this a more awkward start.
Okay, please.
Let's dive into what's really important and what people really want to talk about, because I think it's just so of such primary importance, and that is Melania's dangerous and bold choice of footwear.
I thought you were going to rosary, which I actually thought her encounter with Pope Francis, and the emerging information about her complex family background with faith. I actually thought that's one of the most uncovered but intriguing storylines out of the Trump White House. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why that wasn't of more interest to American reporters as opposed to reporters on the other side of the Atlantic.
Well, I like to play the game of flip it from Catholic to Islamic, or Catholic to Kabbalah. If she wore one of these, Miley Cyrus Madonna Kabbalah wristbands, it would be front page above the fold for a long time. It would be infinitely fascinating to the press. I think it's the fact that it's Catholicism and the Pope was kind of a yawn, and maybe we can, not even notice it. But yeah, she seems to be a sincere believer, and I watched footage of her in front of a statue of the Blessed Mother, and she just seemed very reverent, and the staff said, yeah, she's a practicing Catholic.
But when you look at her own life story, her life coming into the relationship with Trump, and with a bunch of other things, to say the least, there are questions there worthy of checking out, and the sort of thing that would normally be done to an obsessive level of detail by the press if something of a similar depth had emerged, about a previous first lady. I'm not sure they know quite what to do with her. It could be that in some cases, and maybe I should pause here briefly and tell everybody that I was absolutely, totally #never Trump and #never Hillary during the last election, and basically spent the entire thing in a state of agony, as did a lot of my friends, quite frankly, in my own church, and in my own life. And I live in a part of the country that is incredibly historically Republican. East Tennessee was Republican when the Republican was Lincoln. I mean, it has a long history with the party, but yet driving around in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, during the election, I think I saw 3 Trump yard signs. Yet at the same time, this area voted overwhelmingly for Trump. So what does that say? It says that a lot of people in this region, and almost everyone I know, especially really active churchgoers, of whatever denominational fold, a lot of them, or even most of them, voted Trump but they sure didn't want to.
Or they didn't want people to know they were going to vote Trump because
the people I know, they did not want to vote for him. But what I heard, and I think this is one of the great missing religion stories of the last election, diving into content here, which is the story of this election is not the Trump 28% of the Republican vote that is his base and who went for him, and they were there, and there's nothing you can say about him, that will peel them off, his cause. The story is how he got from like 28-29 to winning the election.
Yep.
The reluctant Trump voter, which I would argue was not a Trump voter, but was an anti-Hillary voter. Those people, to me, are the story of the election. And from a lot of different sources, I think a high percentage of them were Catholic, in key states. A Catholic friend of mine who, I won't get into this, but you would know him, does a lot of interviews, and he had just been on a tour of the Rust Belt states. And 10 days before the election, he said, I'm absolutely convinced that Trump is going to win. And I said, not only that, he said, I think he's going to win the Rust Belt. I think he'll take 2 out of 3 of the Rust Belt, the key Rust Belt states. And I told him he was out of his mind. And he said, well, I've just come from there, and here's what I heard from Catholic after Catholic. And what he said is exactly what my friends have told me. It's like a liturgy, an incantation. What these people said was, I don't know what Donald Trump is going to do. I do know what Hillary Clinton is going to do. And thus, I'm going to have to risk it.
That's been called the Flight 93 syndrome. Flight 93, right? We know what the terrorists will do. We don't know what would happen if a non-pilot took control of the plane. Right. So it's certain death and destruction versus maybe your crazy uncle. Maybe it'll be imperfect, but it'll be much, much better. I think that dynamic is certainly at play.
That's certainly a radical way of stating it. Yeah, but I cannot. I cannot tell you how often I heard people say exactly that. And then the very next thing they said is Supreme Court, religious liberty.
Yeah, that's right.
And even people who considered themselves like me, First Amendment liberal radicals, on First Amendment issues. I have a portrait of FDR hanging around the corner up there, and have been a pro-life Democrat my whole life until I left the party in this last election, and am now a third party voter. Even the First Amendment liberals I heard said, how are we supposed to choose between 2 candidates who both hate the First Amendment so much, but for different reasons? Which I thought was a fascinating way to state it. And the key to them all was religious liberty. Yeah.
Do you think...
And it brings us into one of the major coverage areas, in the American press right now.
I think one of the things you do well in your Get Religion columns is you point out what isn't being reported on. We're talking about it right now. The selective ignoring of certain elements of a story, even the ones that are elephantine and in the room. Right. Do you think that Melania's, first of all, she's a beautiful woman. I find her to be absolutely regal. She's just so, seems at peace with herself, and what a difficult job she has. And plus the fact that she seems to be a person of faith. Do you think that domesticated Donald Trump in a certain way, her association with him?
Well, I think that, let's face it, Donald Trump is a target-rich environment. And one of the areas that stands out in that, clearly, is his on-the-record, proud-of-it history with women.
Yep.
So to say that she complicates the issue and implies that there might at least be something different in this man's psyche, in recent years with his relations with his family. By the way, I'm not saying I'm buying that, but I'm saying that it certainly raises that possibility. She is just a complication that the current Trump image in the press doesn't need. And again, I say that as someone who basically is like completely anti-Trump. someone quipped on Twitter the other day, I think it was Ross Douthat of the New York Times, said, we all agree right now that the Trump administration should do nothing but name judges for the next 3 years and leave the rest of American government over to his chief of staff. Or it was some line like that, 140 characters. I find myself in that camp, for the most part. But his wife, there's no question that the way she carries herself in such a unique way is the anti-Trump. And yet there they are. So, yeah, I'd like to know a lot more about her.
My segue here is beautiful women to Hugh Hefner and his death and the launching of the mainstreamization of pornography. I've liked your reportage on Mr. Hefner and the M word, very clever, the M word, not that M word, Methodism. There's been a lot of, I don't know if there's a full biography of Hugh Hefner. Maybe there is. There will come out one now. Yeah. Okay, he's a little bit off my bailiwick, but I find him an interesting figure in American history and a key proto-player in the sexual revolution. I mean, 1953 is not that far away from the late 60s. And much has been made about Mr. Hefner's emotionally distant parents, and in fact, he was never hugged as a boy. And so this Methodist version of Christianity, which may have been more lapsed Methodism as far as we know than, full Jesus-loving Methodism. The press, I think if Mr. Hefner was any other, let's say if he was an agnostic, it would barely be part of the story. But they keep throwing this Methodist thing back into the narrative and covering him.
Well, I've been intrigued with Hefner, as one of my pieces at Get Religion said, because when I was doing my graduate work at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, one of my professors was Theodore Peterson, the former dean of the Urbana Com School. And Peterson taught a very famous class on magazine theory and the history of modern magazines and the development of modern magazines. And one of his former students was Hugh Hefner. And Hefner had apparently at least partially conceived of some kind of First Amendment testing, skin magazine at the time during graduate school, or I believe he was an undergraduate. I was in graduate school, I was an undergrad at the University of Illinois, which is intriguing for a host of reasons. But anyway, we read quite a bit about Hefner in that class. And I remember one piece that got into quite a lot of detail about his family background. I always say that secondhand material must always be considered secondhand material. I don't feel I know much about Hefner's parents at all. We only know what Hefner said about his parents.
Yeah,
I found it way more intriguing, that quote that the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times both featured, where he said something about the fact that, first of all, would Hugh Hefner have been someone that you would have assumed would have saved his virginity for his wedding night?
100% no.
Exactly. But to find out that he did, and that after his marriage, first marriage, he learns that his fiancée had been unfaithful to him while he was away in military service. And Hefner calls that what?
The most
devastating moment of my life.
That was Millie. That was his first wife, right? Because he did a CBS letter to himself, which was a little bizarre to me a couple of years ago when he turned 70 or 80 something. Right. And he changes the narrative altogether. It's some, I even forget the girl's name, but it wasn't the marriage that was wrecked by her unfaithfulness. So he's kind of domesticated it, and but you're right. There's what people say of themselves, and and then there's what really happened. But back to your point, Terry.
Yeah, but to some degree, I would say that I don't think we know who Hugh Hefner was. That's kind of a hard thing to say real quickly. Who Hugh Hefner was before the most devastating moment in his life. Because out of that comes the determination to do Playboy, to take the Playboy philosophy. And in that devastating quote that was in, I believe, the LA Times piece, where he says, if you don't commit, then you don't get hurt.
That's right. That's a money line right there.
Now, if you handed that material to John Paul II and you talked about the theology of the body and the human soul and what is risked and what is revealed in marriage, how do you think St. John Paul II would handle that material? I mean, he would say that Hefner was faced with an astonishingly difficult need to forgive, for one thing, but that he had been literally cut to his soul, and the man's life changes.
Yeah.
I mean, to some degree, he has a choice, and he goes off in a completely different way. And Theodore Peterson's theory of magazines was that at the heart of every modern magazine is to some degree a revealing of the worldview of its creator.
Sure.
And that was key to the appeal of the magazine. So the myth of the debonair guy in the red pajamas with the pipe and the 7-foot round bed and the video cameras overhead, that man, to what degree is that real, or to what degree is that hagiography? To what degree is that literally a depiction of his brokenness?
Yeah,
or just simply the sin that he chose.
And he's the depictor of that. He created, think of it, a non-pornographic pictorial of himself created by himself, kind of sort of a false constructed self to get away from the wounded, devastated person who was, you know, deeply wounded by his wife's infidelity. And you know, you don't want to psychoanalyze. Go ahead.
I believe it was Ross Douthat who wrote, "Man," and every single sentence was a dagger piece about Hefner, where he said basically in his life, it's fascinating that the only people willing to speak the truth about Hefner are doctrinaire religious believers and doctrinaire feminists. People who were willing to look past the many donations to abortion rights causes and whatever and say, let's look at how this man actually appears to have treated women in his life. And so that's one of those classic cases where you go around the poles to the left and the right, and you get at least some interesting ground in the back.
My friend, well, it's tempting and easy to psychoanalyze and say, well, because of he was dropped on his head when he was 4, therefore this is why he did that. But my friend Christopher West went on ABC Nightline a few years ago and got into a bit of hot water because he compared his hero, John Paul II, and his theology of the body with Hefner. Of course, the graphic was, oh, Christopher West, 2 heroes, Hugh Hefner and John Paul II, which is insane. That's not what he meant. But he was going to the fact that Hefner had this touch hunger, this lack of affirmation by his mother and his father, and they were both professed Christians, and Christopher was surmising that maybe there was some element, if not of revenge in starting Playboy magazine, a kind of a reaching out for that human touch. Of course, it will never fulfill itself. But it reminds me, and I want to get your take on this, you may have heard this quote. I can't find the actual source material for this, but I've heard this quoted before. It's something that's been attributed to John Paul II. If you can find it, or if you know, I'd be happy. He said, or is alleged to have said, the problem with pornography is not that it shows too much, but that it shows too little.
I'm not familiar with that quote, but it sounds consistent with his thought.
Yeah, it does.
Once again, I want to stress, the secondhand material about Hefner does not interest me that much. I just found those 2 statements from his own lips on the record to major newspapers. I find them utterly fascinating. And that's why in the podcast that I did about Hefner, I stressed that he was explicitly a moral theologian, in that he said his goal was to overturn the sexual morality of the Judeo-Christian ethic, because he believed it was crazy and dangerous.
Well, that's
is the flip side which is the flip side of the coin of Veritas Splendor and theology of the body.
Well, that's why what you just said is probably why Dr. Anthony Esselin called him Bishop Hugh Hefner. Do you know Tony Esselin's stuff?
Yes, I do. In fact, I interviewed him for a column.
Oh, great.
Just recently about kind of his move, why he did what he did, etc.
Yeah, he's back a few episode a few months ago. You can hear my conversation with him on what on earth happened to the culture. Tony Eslin's a marvelous, he's Dom Perignon type writer, great guy. Just lingering on Hefner just for a moment, because I want to go to Stephen Pollack and the Amy Comey Barrett story, and the kneeling controversy with the NFL. Bishop Thomas Olmsted of Phoenix, Arizona, wrote a pastoral letter called "Into the Breach," and one of the figures he brings up is James Bond, and it reminded me of Hugh Hefner. There's Hefner, the silk pajama piped guy, above the fray. Women are sort of like little mice in his pocket, but meanwhile he's supposed to be this great liberator of women and a First Amendment hero. But really, he lived a sad life. At the end, those around him, again, this is a secondhand source, but there seems to be this repeated testimony that he ended his life very lonely, very, let's say, not able to enjoy normal sexuality, turned to gay porn and Viagra and so on. Not the sort of the anti-image of the playboy himself. Mm-hmm. But back to James Bond, Bishop Olmsted makes the point that even the name Bond is ironic because he's unable to bond with women. He can't settle with one woman. He's got to go from woman to woman, city to city, conquest to conquest, killing and bedding with equal fervor, without having that rootedness, without risking getting hurt, as Hugh Hefner got hurt.
Which is intriguing because in the last couple of Bond films, and I am no aficionado of Bond. In fact, I haven't even watched the entire recent films, but I've seen and read enough about them, specifically by Catholic writers and others, to know that they've done a kind of origin story for Bond's brokenness. Yeah. And apparently in one of the films, there ends up being a battle in, is it the historic Bond home?
It is, yeah. It's a priest hole. That's where the big, it's a Eucharist-free Catholic chapel, and his Catholic faith, his Catholic background. That's a very interesting backstory. It's Skyfall. It's the movie Skyfall.
Yeah, okay. I mean, you're right. So I've been intrigued that it's a better story to add some sort of brokenness and depth for what otherwise has previously just been a grinning, sly, repeated motif, in all the Bond movies. Yeah, I find that fascinating. You might be interested in knowing that years ago, at the time of his movie The Apostle, I had a chance to interview Robert Duvall.
Oh, terrific! Love that movie.
If you're going to make any short list of the great American actors of the late 20th century, Duvall has got to go up there on the male 3 to 5. Duvall is not a believer, but he's fascinated with the role of religious belief in Southern culture. And that shows, his willingness to go into prisons and talk to ministers who fell and who murdered and whatever, and talk about their faith, which is all the research he did preparing that. And of course, that movie grew out of how intrigued he was with evangelicalism, out of what I think is his greatest film, which is Tender Mercies, the film
Terry,
that the Academy Award for.
Goosebump moment. I've watched it 8 or 9 times. I own Bruce Beresford's shooting script copy of by Horton Foote, so I'm all over Tender Mercies. Magnificent.
Okay. Well, yeah. Do you know of a better, more realistic depiction of religious conversion?
It's one of the few examples of a film that's stout-heartedly Christian without any whiff of message or left behind. It's just so mature and so subtle. Yeah, it's a beautiful film. Tender Mercies.
So anyway, he came out of that film, did The Apostle, and in my interview with him about The Apostle, he said Hollywood doesn't want to deal with the reality of sin, and thus has trouble with brokenness and repentance, which means it misses some of the greatest stories, which are stories that potentially end in redemption. Instead of just but he said, but that's all off-camera stuff. That doesn't fit the plot. Yeah. He said, meanwhile, the modern Christian church doesn't seem to want to deal with stories that involve real sin and have trouble dealing with the actual complexity and messiness of sin. And thus, he said, we don't, he was basically talking about why are Christian movies so lousy.
Yeah.
Which ironically, in a famous line from Bob the Tomato of the VeggieTales days, Phil Vischer famously said, Christian movies are terrible for the same reason that pornography is terrible. They're made on low budgets, the characters don't matter, and everybody knows how they end.
Phil was one of my instructors on Act One, writing for Hollywood. I've never heard that line before. That's good.
Okay, but so anyway, we're back to the complexity of human life. So Hugh Hefner saying this failure of fidelity after he said he saved himself for marriage with the help of a lot of foreplay. But, you know, that's
it sounds like a Woody Allen line.
Yeah, a Hefner witticism.
Mm-hmm.
But still, I mean, I take him at face value when he says that moment was the most devastating moment of my life. And if that is the case, we have brokenness and a choice of where he goes from there. And that, friends and neighbors, is a story of moral theology. And if you could leave, I was surprised the degree to which the major newspapers included religious material in the Hefner obits. I thought they were way better than I expected when I popped open my computer screen that morning and reading. I thought readers didn't, get the full. We had to wait for Ross Douthat and others to go there later. But boy, there was more there than I expected.
Yep. Yeah. That's one of the more ironically enjoyable parts of the New York Times, because their religion reporting. I have a book in my head I'd love to read. I'd love to write called "Religion Reporting Sucks" and what you can do about it. If I didn't know, we're shifting now to a slightly broader topic, but if I didn't know what a designated hitter was, the New York Times would never let me cover a Mets game. Neither would the Boston Globe. And yet I find so many basic, forget the obvious bias and the left-wing nature of the premises of most religion reporting in America, but the errors of fact on, let's say, how Catholicism works. It's almost like most religion reporters are skilled musicians in the accordion, but they can't play, Led Zeppelin, and they try to import their writing talents into a structure that involves transcendent belief and moral principles. And I like to play spot the error line by line, and there's lots of them. And I don't get that in political editorials or coverage about sports. There seems to be an emphasis on accuracy because a lot of the readers are really sharp-minded sports fans. But when it comes to religion reporting, it's like the ugly stepchild.
Well, this is, of course, one of the obsessions of my life and has been since the late 70s when I first began reading up and studying on these kind of things. You didn't mention it, but let's take an area of life and when facts really matter and people literally bet billions of dollars on them. Try to imagine the New York Times allowing a degree of inaccuracy in its business reporting.
Right.
The Wall Street Journal. Try to imagine the Wall Street Journal accepting a level of inaccuracy and unbalance in business reporting that you see in just as common occurrence in religion writing. Now, there was a great moment over a decade ago. In fact, as old as I am, it might have been 2 decades ago. Let's put it this way. It was so old, it was in the age of the fax machine.
Was Elton John still straight?
We won't go there. Don't divert me again.
Okay.
The Washington Post needed a new religion writer, and famously, they prepared a job notice and they put it up on the Washington Post bulletin board so that people could apply in-house if they wished. It became one of the more celebrated things in modern debates about modern religion writing because someone faxed a copy of it to Julia Dean, who's one of the writers now for Get Religion and a national religion reporter. And the job notice said it all. And it basically wanted new religion reporter, The ideal candidate. Now, to me, the key word is ideal. The ideal candidate for this post is neither religious nor an expert on religion.
Wow.
Now, what I thought, there's two parts to this, and let's unpack it a little. First of all, I have known tremendous religion writers who were not believers, but they viewed religion reporting as kind of like social science. But they knew they had to have the facts right. They knew that they had to be able to understand what was going on in people's lives and whatever. I have known great religion writers who were not believers. Okay, so we just have to say that first off. So I don't have that much of a problem with that part with the equation. The ideal candidate is not a religious believer, although once again, ideal strikes me as strange there.
Yeah.
Ideal candidate, but it's the second part that offends me. Try to imagine a job notice for any elite coastal newspaper, let alone one in the Acela zone. That term I use at Get Religion all the time, but Washington to Boston, the Acela zone, the high-end train. The one that not even Joe Biden didn't even write it. Okay, it was too elite for Joe Biden. But anyway, imagine a job listing that said, wanted, NFL beat reporter. The ideal reporter is not an NFL fan and doesn't actually know anything at all about football.
Right. Ding, 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 ding.
Or click in... you're going to send someone to cover the World Cup of soccer.
Yeah.
It might help that they know something about soccer. But back to the to the Acela zone papers, wanted Supreme Court reporter.
Right.
The ideal candidate is not a lawyer and has no background whatsoever in the actual facts of law. One more, wanted, because I've always compared religion reporting with opera. There's like an emotional level, but a factual level and technical level at the same time. Wanted, classical music and opera critic.
Sure.
The ideal candidate for this position at the New York Times, let's say, does not like opera, does not like fine art, and has no background whatsoever or any proven record of being able to write about it.
Right. You could endlessly fit that template. Science and medicine.
Yeah. So here's what we're actually encountering. What we're encountering, in my belief, is a conviction that the world of religion is not essentially about facts.
Right.
It's primarily about emotion and feeling. And if you have someone who knows a lot about religion, they might be too committed to it to be able to cover it. So we need so the ideal word becomes, we need someone with a fresh, open report who will view this through unfiltered eyes.
Yeah. So religious faith provides an unacceptable, a fatal bias,
which is interesting because when you then turn it around and saying, well, is the result that we get coverage that's unbiased and and treats believers on both sides of these great tense battles in American life,
right,
treats people on both sides with respect, is that what we're getting? We get exactly the opposite.
Right. Leading
up to that signature moment in the life of Get Religion a couple of years ago, coming up on 8 years ago, I guess, when Bill Keller, the recently retired as of like a week or two, editor of the New York Times, was asked a question in a speaking engagement in Austin, Texas. And he was asked, does your newspaper skew the news to the left?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a liberal newspaper? He says, we're liberal. We're liberal in the way that liberal arts colleges are liberal. We're urban. We're tolerant, etc. He goes on and he lists a couple of issues like abortion and gay rights, gay marriage. He mentions creationism. So he lists some things. And again, the interviewer comes back and said, so do you lean stories to the left?
Mm-hmm.
And here's the crucial words. He says, aside from those cultural issues and things of that sort, I don't believe we do.
I heard the food in the Hindenburg was delicious.
So in my column about that, I said, so what are the major moral and cultural issues in American life right now. Abortion, gay rights, art, education, science, I listed all these things and said, other than that, that's all.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And when you lead to the fact that the single most important issue in American politics over the last 20, 25 years or so has been the Supreme Court. And what are the Supreme Court cases that have been the source of most division and most heat as opposed to light in American politics? They almost all pivot on moral and cultural issues. So what was Bill Keller saying? What was he saying?
He was saying the answer is yes, but he used a few thousand words. Terry, let me press pause now because I want to get to the shocking moment when Senator Dianne Feinstein challenged a Muslim woman's faith in an appeals court Senate hearing. This is the Patrick Coffin Show, a very brief invitation, and we shall be right back with Terry Mattingly of GetReligion.org. Don't miss it. Have you ever been to Italy? By Italy, I mean Catholic Italy. Siena, Orvieto, Assisi, Rome. Well, if you haven't, I want to invite you to join us next year with our spiritual director, Father David Genuine. He's from the Diocese of Santa Rosa. We're going to be there April 3rd until the 12th, 2018. If you sign up before November 3rd, you get $100 off per ticket. Also, if you pay by check, it's $130 off before November 3rd. That's our early bird pricing. We're going to do wine tasting. We're going to see the site of the Eucharistic miracle in Orvieto, which gave us the Feast of Corpus Christi. We're going to see Pope Francis. It's Divine Mercy Sunday, folks, and we're going to be there at St. Peter's Basilica in April. Next year, I want you to join us. Here's the sign-up link, patrickcoffin.media/Italy. patrickcoffin.media/Italy. We've got a confirmed dinner guest as Edward Penton. He's the top Vatican journalist living in Rome from the UK. He'll be joining us. Cardinal Francis Arinze is set to join us as well for a luncheon, and other cardinals with whom we've invited. So more about that as we go on. But the main thing, this is a pilgrimage of prayer. Rome, Assisi, Siena, Orvieto, the four major basilicas, a scabby tour beneath St. Peter's where we'll see the site of the bones of St. Peter. This is a once-in-a-lifetime trip. I can't wait to meet you. We're only taking one bus. This is not one of those mega 4-bus deals where you don't actually meet anyone in any close personal way. This is an intimate setting soaked with prayer, including Tuscan wine and food tasting along the way. I want you to be there and join us at patrickcoffin.media/Italy. Do hope you sign up soon. Okay, we're back with Terry Mattingly on the Patrick Coffin Show. So glad to have you join us. Terry, I'm really enjoying this conversation because it just scratches me where I itch on so many different levels. I was, with tongue firmly planted in cheek, talking about Senator Dianne Feinstein asking a Muslim appeals court judge candidate in a Senate hearing about her Muslim faith, and she said that Sharia law lives loudly in her, and this is of concern. Of course, she's talking about Catholic dogma as though being a believer in Christ as a Catholic disqualifies one from objectively reading and applying American law. Is there any other faith besides Christianity where someone could openly, because Senator Al Franken did the same thing, who appeared mildly intoxicated, I must say. Just my read on that. If you watch Al Franken go after the judge candidate, Amy Coney Barrett, would that be done of a Jewish or a Buddhist or a Confucian or a Muslim candidate? Is it imaginable? That kind of fine-tuning?
I think you know the answer to that. You just spent several thousand words to say that.
The good borrow, the great steal.
To turn that back around. I don't even think we really need to discuss that. I was more interested in why, the method through which that became a news story.
In what way?
And I'm referring to the loud dogma story.
Yeah.
In fact, I think it's an example of one of the major problems we have today, both in religion writing and in political reporting. So let me briefly explain what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. When that story broke, the first piece I wrote about Get Religion, at Get Religion about that incident, there was hardly anything online about what happened. And I wanted to know why. And then a very interesting thing happened. that story exploded onto Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
But it only exploded among conservative writers. If you follow an array of people on Twitter on both the journalistic left and right, there was like no conversation that began immediately in mainstream. It was all in alternative conservative Christian settings, which, of course, elite level journalists, very few of them listen to that. So they didn't hear that explosion. Then, a couple of days later, I believe it was 2 days later, the excellent religion reporter of the Atlantic Monthly, Emma Green, who she's writing from an analysis perspective at the Atlantic. But I just, I appreciated the fact that she put most of the key facts into play and showed the kind of range of opinion that existed on what happened. So the story broke in the mainstream in an analysis piece. So in normal hard news, you have hard news, you have day two, then you have analysis. The loud dogma story broke in the mainstream in analysis at the Atlantic, at which point everybody in the mainstream press was drugged back into coverage, kind of kicking and screaming behind the fact. But what this shows essentially is that in American journalism right now, we essentially have not the old American model of the press at work, but on crucial issues, as Bill Keller suggested, primarily social, cultural, religious, and moral, we now have a different philosophy of the press, which is open advocacy. Aside from moral and cultural issues, I believe we cover the news straight. So we have a kind of limited European journalism in effect that affects coverage of religion, moral, culture, etc. And meanwhile, conservatives can't understand why this, why stories like this get covered or not covered the way they do, which brings me to what I think is a crucial point. So just please hear this. You opened the show with a kind of thing, if you're interested in saving the culture, I don't remember exactly what your words were. This isn't my intent at all at Get Religion. At Get Religion, I'm simply interested in a kind of intellectual diversity that is supposed to be at the heart of liberal American journalism. Liberal in the sense that it used to mean. Like liberal First Amendment rights.
Kennedy-era classic American liberal.
Classic liberalism, what I call old guard First Amendment liberalism. If you want liberalism and diversity in American journalism, then you should have newsrooms that contain some intellectual and cultural diversity. And there was a remarkable New York Times study done in the about 2004, 2005, when the Times was in the midst of a crisis, an ethical crisis involving plagiarism. We don't have a lot of time to discuss that, but it was a really important event. And the Times, to its credit, did an independent study. They hired a bunch of people to come in, interview everybody at the Times. Nobody could turn down the interviews, and they wrote a report on what the Times needed to do. And in that report, it said, we need more intellectual and cultural diversity in our newsroom. We don't understand about half of America. And over it mentioned religion, military service, and kind of non-urban elite America as crucial points. The editor of the paper, who just happened to be Bill Keller, that same guy, Keller embraced all of that report except the part about changing hiring practices.
Well, is the other 50% being serviced as readers?
Well, that gets us now to the Trump election, in which the readers' representative of the New York Times, Liz Spayed, a liberal's liberal in the best sense of those words, former editor of the Columbia Journalism Review, if I recall, Columbia Journalism School, faculty, etc. Liz Spayed, in the wake of the Trump election, basically asked, is the New York Times interested in covering the other half of America? And she wrote a number of columns about this. I thought she was very courageous. I gave her views a lot of ink, digital ink, at Get Religion. And of course, eventually she was fired. She was let go.
Well,
But see, here's the key point, though. There's two reasons that we lack intellectual diversity in a lot of those newsrooms. One of them has to do with the worldview and potential cultural biases of many of the gatekeepers. I think that's pretty obvious. We're back to that Washington Post job notice, okay?
Yeah.
But the other half of it, and this is where I have a bone of contention with Catholic education in America, is that America's religious colleges and universities have done next to nothing to deal with journalism in a serious manner, to try to prepare students to work in these newsrooms on the terms of those newsrooms. With the old model, the American model, where people on both sides are treated with respect, we have helped raise up a counterculture, alternative, conservative media, which doesn't get heard in the Acela zone. And we wonder, in other words, we've contributed to the problem as well as they have.
But
people who are listening to this show, and if they have any influence at all with their priests and other church leaders, let alone Catholic education, put out a plea for mainstream and even the alternative conservative Catholic schools to get interested in journalism.
100%.
Hire real journalists from mainstream media and try to produce some diversity in this field, which is what I do at the King's College and what I did for 20 years with the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities in Washington. And I have made numerous appeals to Catholic schools to become more involved. And other than Franciscan in Steubenville, which has sent us some excellent students through the years, the number of Catholic schools sending students to this program is like nil.
That is a conversation for another show. It's very, very important. I agree 101%. Can you summarize the Tim Tebow versus Colin Kaepernick and then the two versions of Christianity, the acceptable and the not so acceptable? Because it's a good point of contrast. What's that?
Yeah. It's really important for people to realize that the press, even the press as we have it, the Acela Zone press, is not opposed to religion. In fact, it believes there are religious truths that are absolute. It just believes that some of them are. So thus you have good religion and you have bad religion. Pope Francis is good when he says we need to stress things other than abortion. But that doesn't mean that you cover his speech the very next day to the National Pro-Life Convention in Italy. I mean, in other words, you quote Pope Francis when he's doing good religion, but the whole rest of the context of that, who am I to judge? Thing, with the implication about confession and people who are still seeking God. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of Francis, but my gosh, has any pope talked more about confession?
And the devil.
And then the devil and other things in recent history than this pope? There's a whole lot of Francis that is bad religion that isn't getting coverage, as opposed to the good Francis who gets lots of coverage.
Lutheran satire have done some funny stuff on this.
Oh, mercy. So back to the NFL. There's good kneeling and there's bad kneeling. And the Washington Post recently picked up a piece by a evangelical evangelism professor in Australia. It was Australia, not New Zealand, right? It was Australia. And in which he kind of created a template that Colin Kaepernick represents a kind of good kneeling, a kind of social activist kneeling. And he contrasted him with Tim Tebow, son of missionaries, evangelist, virgin, et cetera, et cetera. And he didn't say that that was bad. In fact, he deliberately said our culture needs to be listening to both. But I thought it was kind of awkward that he, in his original piece, avoided the fact that Tim Tebow's entire life has included service to prisoners, the poor, orphans.
Before he was a star.
Mentally handicapped, et cetera. So in effect, Tebow represents someone who is kind of trying to do both. Now, I'm not prying into Kaepernick's private religious life. I've seen pictures of him kneeling in the prayer circles at the end of football games, you know, with other believers, as well as the demonstrations. I've had other people write all kinds of nasty things to me about Colin Kaepernick. I'm not interested. What I'm saying is that what we had here is a really interesting question about what's acceptable religion in American public life and what isn't. And I thought it deserved serious news coverage, not just kind of like a one-off Washington Post op-ed.
Well,
I'm fascinated by this.
Yeah, no, me too. There's just so much to be said just about that particular story, and the others we ran out of time on. Terry, I have a band of goons I'm willing to send out and force you to come back on the show in the future. I wish we had more time to crank through other stuff. I've got some radio stations syndicate the show, and they are asking for a particular format. But I do hope you come back. I'm a huge fan of your writing. I want to mention your book as well, Pop Goes Religion, Faith in Popular Culture. How can people...
The Robert Duvall interview, by the way. The Robert
Duvall interview? Okay, good. And you have a podcast. Tell us about how can we connect?
If you go to GetReligion.org, we do a weekly podcast, which is produced with friends of mine, a journalist and a pastor, the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, and it's produced through Lutheran Public Radio in St. Louis, and that comes out every week. People can get on the list for that either at iTunes or they can obtain it off the listserv at getreligion.org.
Terrific. Terry Mattingly, it's been a real treat. Thanks for joining us. I know you're busy, and I've had a good time. I know the listeners love it as well. We're getting great feedback. And by the way, I want to post some links of some of the books and movies that we mentioned at the show notes at patrickcoffin.media. Thanks again, Terry.
Glad to be here.
All right, this is the Patrick Coffin Show. Per the T-shirt, be a saint. What else is there?